you have Johnson surprising almost everybody on the face of the earth by saying, I will not seek nor will I accept the nomination of my party for another term as president, which maybe was acknowledging the political reality that he was going to have to fight to win the nomination. And even if he won, then being the nominee of a divided party is never a good formula for winning the election in November.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and we are pleased to bring you another episode of Scholar Talks. For this episode, we're honored to have on scholar Michael Nelson, who's going to discuss his new book, Resilient America, Electing Nixon, Channeling Dissent, and Dividing Government. And the guiding question for this episode is going to be, how did American institutions prove their resilience during the tumultuous 1968 presidential election? And by way of introduction, Dr. Michael Nelson is the Fulmer Professor of Political Science at Rhodes College and Senior Fellow at the UVA Jack Miller Center. He is an expert on the American presidency and has written and edited several books, including the aforementioned Resilient America, which is the topic for today, but also The American Presidency, Origins and Development, 1776 to 2021, and The Presidency and the Political System in its 12th edition. His wide-ranging interests include such diverse topics as published articles on Frank Sinatra, Charles Dickens, the Iliad and the Odyssey, baseball, music, and a whole wide range of diverse topics. So very interesting. Michael, I want to thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Tony.
Yeah, you know, one of the reasons why I love your book, Resilient America, is that, you know, it really speaks to some of the divisions going on maybe in our own society, and just kind of the enduring relevance of examining differences, debate, you know, divisions in American society, and just how resilient that great civic virtue, how resilient our political institutions have seen us through some of those problems, not only in 1968, but a civil war and foreign wars and other problems. So it speaks to a very, very important topic. But we'd also love to get you on future episodes on your just seminal landmark studies on the American presidency, because they have really shaped the field. And so thank you for joining us, though, on Resilient America. So let's dive right in here. Can you describe some post-war political trends? You know, sort of in the first few chapters of the book, you talk about, you know, how the New Deal, how the Democrats forge a New Deal liberal coalition. The Republicans are making some inroads into the Sun Belt, the West and the South, which had traditionally been the solid South for the Democrats. Also the rise of a conservative intellectual movement, and also that vital center, what scholars call a vital center after World War II, and maybe some of the cracks that were starting to appear in the 1960s. So if you can describe maybe a few of those trends, that would be great.
Well, I'm going to take post-war to mean post-World War II. Although Resilient America is more about the Vietnam War, a different war, a different kind of war. But you know, if you look at the whole sweep of American political history since the end of World War II, which was almost 80 years ago now, part of the one theme that sort of marks that period is the disintegration gradually of what had been the governing coalition, the New Deal coalition, forged by Franklin Roosevelt during his first term. Part of that disaggregation, that disintegration of the New Deal coalition, was the South beginning to move out of its solid Democratic past and into a more sort of up for grabs, and then ultimately primarily Republican region. The white working class, which was essentially the mainstay of the New Deal coalition coming out of the Depression of World War II, has come to, again, move through a period of being politically up for grabs. Certainly Nixon saw the white working class as a target community for the Republican Party. And now we see the white working class as the mainstay of the Republican Party. So I think, you know, we could, heaven knows, we could probably spend hours talking about how American politics is different now than it was in the aftermath of World War II. But I think sort of an overarching governing theme is that we used to have a majority party coming out of that war. It was a Democratic Party. And we don't have a majority party anymore. We have two highly competitive political parties. You know, it used to be that Republicans, if you looked at the income, a voter's income, the higher it was, the more likely they were to vote Republican. We can't say that anymore. It used to be that states like California were mainstays of the Republican coalition. You can't say that anymore. You'd have to say the opposite. So a lot of sort of fragmenting of once had appeared to be solid, and 68 being a key year there, which we may want to talk about specifically. But what once was sort of seemed like it was enduring and maybe even permanent, no longer the case.
Right. And so in the wake of JFK's assassination, Lyndon Johnson just seemed to be sort of on top of the world, if you will, right? He won a massive landslide against Barry Goldwater, who was a conservative Republican, had great success initially in his presidency, pushed forward the Great Society legislation, the Vietnam War initially popular, Cold War popularity as well. So he seemed very successful early on, but what are some of the turbulent events of the mid 1960s that will help shape that 1968 election, and he won't win re-election?
Yeah, the 60s is a really interesting decade, and it's more than just the late 60s when we had the protest movements and so on. The 60s began with what had been the post-World War II sense of confidence, almost to the point of arrogance among Americans, that anything the United States sets its mind to, any problem it sets out to solve, domestic or foreign, the government is capable of solving that. And we see coming into the early 60s, confidence in government, trust in government. The government of Washington now is exceptionally high. And Lyndon Johnson, when he becomes president in the immediate aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, is certainly in keeping with that spirit. He wants to form a great society which will end all the problems of poverty, of sort of cultural detachment. I mean, every problem you can imagine in the United States, LBJ, thought could be solved through the Great Society. And at the same time, feeling like that on the international stage, winning the Vietnam War was just a matter of American will and persistence. And there's a tragic arc to the Johnson presidency, which begins with such promise and such accomplishment and a landslide election in 1964. And then over the course of the second term, the tragic arc bends steeply downward because of opposition to the war, because of disappointment with the failure of the Great Society to solve every problem of poverty and alienation. And by the time 1968 begins, Johnson is on the ropes. He's being challenged for the nomination of his own party, first by Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, and then Senator Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the slain president of New York. And by the end of March, he has actually reached the conclusion that he needs to withdraw from the election. That is, that as somebody of a certain age who can remember watching television that night in the fraternity house and expecting to hear yet another speech about the Vietnam War, and hearing that speech, and then at the end, you have Johnson surprising almost everybody on the face of the earth by saying, "I will not seek, nor will I accept the nomination of my party for another term as president," which maybe was acknowledging the political reality that he was going to have to fight to win the nomination. And even if he won, then being the nominee of a divided party is never a good formula for winning the election in November. But for whatever complicated reasons, Johnson ended up, I don't know if you want to call him a victim or a self-inflicted casualty of his own presidency.
Yeah, almost seems a Greek tragedy, right? Kind of this epic rise and fall in some ways.
Followed by another Greek tragedy, right? I mean, his successor Richard Nixon were getting ahead of the game, but the one who was elected in 68, and then like Johnson, was elected once again by a historic landslide. And then it seems like at the apex of political triumph, the downward trajectory begins and the presidency crashes and burns. In a sense, Nixon leaves the White House the same way Johnson did, by voluntarily stepping down in the face of possibly being forced out. And in Nixon's case, he almost certainly would have been forced out.
Right, right. And you mentioned a divided Democratic Party, and that's a great segue into my next question, is that you described the Democratic Party as divided in many ways between these party regulars, kind of the old union members, and kind of the proverbial, guys in the back room smoking the cigars, with its more progressive wing. So how does this play out in the 1968 election? With such diverse candidates as Hubert Humphrey, Robert Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, and how does it affect party prospects in presidential elections for the next few decades?
Well, and let's not forget George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, a Democrat who ended up running as an independent in 68 and getting 13% of the national popular vote and carrying 4 states, and seeming for a while there that he was going to deny either the Republican nominee Nixon or the Democratic nominee Humphrey a majority of electoral votes, in which case it would have gone into the House of Representatives. I mean, that sort of hung over the whole year. But the Democrats, having been a majority party, of necessity in a country as diverse as ours, means that party, that majority, includes groups whose interests and ambitions are in tension with each other. And certainly one of the grand stories of the post-World War II era, which plays out in the 60s, is the rise of the civil rights movement and its achievement of major legislation assuring voting rights, cementing the loyalty of Black voters to the Democratic Party, and thereby creating a kind of tension with the existing Democratic coalition, which included white Southerners, which included white working class voters. And then you have in 68 the sort of aggravating circumstance of divisions within the party over the Vietnam War, which the Johnson administration was obviously, along with the Kennedy administration, by the way. I wouldn't give Kennedy a pass on this, but this was their war. And yet there was an enormous amount of opposition, especially among younger Democrats, to the war, and that was the sort of raw material out of which Eugene McCarthy and then Robert Kennedy were able to mount a challenge to Johnson. Now, do we see in 68 what we see, sort of the seeds of what we see today in the tension within the Democratic Party between progressives and more, I don't know what you'd call them, moderate liberal Democrats? Yeah, to some degree, the modern progressives are sort of the political descendants of the forces within the party that challenged and in effect drove Lyndon Johnson from office.
Right, and as a follow-up, it gets kind of complicated, but the 68, 72, these different party rules in terms of the nominating process really kind of shaped the Democrats into a more progressive party. Right?
It did. I mean, what I think, for a while there, and maybe still, political scientists, those who study American politics, those who study political parties, have tended to look at the reformed nominating process that came out of the 68 breakdown within the Democratic Party, the reforms that came out of that in the form of the McGovern-Fraser Commission, which essentially created the modern nominating process, where every delegate to both parties' conventions has to compete in an open primary, an open caucus. There are no party leaders, there are no party bosses sort of wiring things. It's who can get the most votes from rank and file party members in primaries and caucuses. Okay. There's a sense that maybe that among many scholars that made the process too small d democratic. I would say this, one of the things about 68 is that for many people, it felt like a year, not unlike the year we're in now, when the country might literally be coming apart at the seams. And part of my argument in Resilient America is that our political institutions, including the parties, in the aftermath of 68, were open enough so that every group that felt sort of left out in 68, remember that there was no anti-war candidate on the ballot in November. It was Hubert Humphrey, who promised a sort of mild departure from President Johnson's policies. Humphrey was vice president in the administration. Nixon, who clearly was not an anti-war progressive. The fact that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party sort of opened up meant that those who felt like they hadn't prevailed in 68 had a way of getting back into the system, had an open door to get back into the system. And by the way, the same being true for the many Southerners, white Southerners, but also white working class people who voted for George Wallace, that the openness of the parties kept them from sort of spinning out into permanent alienation. So, it's a point of frustration, I think, sometimes for students of American politics, that power within the system is so decentralized, branches of government, levels of government, but the political parties that operate in all states. But my argument is that the more sort of ways into the system, the more doors that are open in one institution to another, to any group that is seeking to influence the course of government and policy, public policy, having a variety of open doors means that voters who might be very unhappy today don't feel like, well, I'm giving up on the whole system. There's no way that I can ever have a voice in the system. Yeah, there are multiple ways, and the system, in a sense, was able to absorb all the dissent that came out of that very divisive year of 1968, absorb it and keep us going. I mean, we've still got the Constitution, we've still got the same political parties, we've still got so much that seemed to be under the gun in 1968.
Right, good. So we've talked about the Democrats, and over on the Republican side, the 68 election seemed to see a similar kind of split, that you had the rise of these Sun Belt conservatives and this conservative intellectual movement over these more liberal Eastern establishment Republicans. So how does it shape Nixon's nomination, and how is it maybe going to culminate in the rise of the Reagan Republicans during the 1980s?
Well, Nixon was, remember, he was on the ballot for president or vice president in 5 different elections, dating back to 1952, when he was Eisenhower's running mate. So Nixon had certainly been a major figure in the Republican Party during almost all of the post-World War II era. And he saw in 1964, when Goldwater captured the nomination, he saw what was happening to the party, and that power within the Republican Party was moving in a sense south and west, away from the northeastern Dewey, Rockefeller, et cetera, liberal Republican establishment, moving south and west, and also moving to the right. And so when he planned his candidacy for the nomination in 1968, he realized that he's going to have to somehow find a way of broadening his appeal within the party, which he did to conservatives, without going as far to the right as Goldwater, who'd been in the nominee in 64 and lost overwhelmingly. Nixon sort of saw what was happening. I think Nixon, in some ways, he's associated in many scholarly works now with the Southern strategy, right? With the idea that you play on issues of race in order to build a majority coalition rooted in the South. That happened during his presidency. It didn't happen in 68. The coalition he was seeking to build in the November election, once he had the nomination, was a very traditional. His targets were the large states with a lot of electoral votes. And he carried, California, he carried Illinois, he carried Ohio. He was following a traditional strategy then. As far as the South goes, he knew that George Wallace was going to carry the Deep South. And basically the Southern states that he targeted in 68 were states that Eisenhower had carried twice, that Nixon himself had carried in 1960, the sort of outer South states, states like Virginia and Tennessee, Florida, North Carolina. So in that sense, once he got the nomination, having sort of run a little bit to the right, if you will, he followed the traditional playbook in the general election of moving back toward the political center.
Okay, excellent. And final question, and you've talked about it a little bit, but can you expand upon the idea of how did this seminal 1968 presidential election lead to divided government, and how did it demonstrate the resilience of those American institutions amid a very contentious election? And for us coming out of 2020 and other contentious elections, what lessons might a divided America today learn from 1968?
Well, one thing is that we've been through times in the living memory of some of us, even though it's been a half century ago, we have been through times. You don't have to go all the way back to the Civil War to find a time when it seemed like the country was coming apart. To many people, it felt that way in 1968, and yet it didn't come apart in 1968. The resilience of our political institutions enabled America to, instead of coming apart at the seams, to sort of come back together. That is my hope. I mean, history does not repeat itself. As somebody once said, it may rhyme, but it doesn't repeat itself. One hopes that the lesson you can take away from the Civil War, from 1968, from the deep divisions over whether to ratify the Constitution back in 1788 and 9, from the incredibly vitriolic early presidential elections in our, one hopes one can take away from those series of things, including 68, that whatever we're going through now will not be, things will not just continue to break further and further and further apart. Now, that's a hope, but I think it's a hope that is grounded in history. And that's why I'm optimistic that although we're going through a rough patch now, it is not the roughest patch we've ever gone through, and managed to come out the other side of.
Right. Michael, I think that's a great note to end on. One of hope and optimism that we can again sort of unite according to the better angels of our nature, if you will. As Americans, whatever our differences over policy and that kind of thing. So, I want to thank you for coming on. The book is Resilient America with the University Press of Kansas, Electing Nixon in 1968, Channeling Dissent and Dividing Government. Thank you again.
My pleasure.
And I also want to thank all of you for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our library of interviews, including our series, The Cold War and the Presidency, and also our free online textbook, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, for more resources on post-war modern America. Thank you.